presentar en el día de hoy en el primer seminario del Instituto Show, en el área nuestra, en el cual comenzamos también a introducirnos en el mundo de la investigación. Y bueno, es un excelente momento para recibir a dos visitantes que ya tienen ese camino llevado durante muchos años. Nuestra colega Elaine también es contadora y ya es una investigadora con muchas publicaciones y desarrollo en esto, así que lo que aspiramos es que poder llegar nosotros a seguir el ejemplo de ella. Me pareció un excelente momento como para arrancar este seminario de nuestra área, en las presentaciones tanto de Patrick, en lo que es la experiencia de la educación y todo lo que es la actividad de los estudiantes, en lo que es su experiencia en el juego y lo que es la forma distinta de estudiar, como la de Elaine en cuanto al área de lo que es impuestos, en lo cual es los dilemas éticos de quienes hacemos asesoramiento impositivo y nos encontramos con situaciones complejas, en las cuales a partir de su investigación nos aporta claridad justamente. Así que bueno, comenzamos entonces con Patrick a su presentación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Hola, mi nombre es Patrick Buckley y soy de la Universidad de Londres. He estado aprendiendo español por solo un año. Puedo pedir comida y bebida, pero necesito dar esta presentación en inglés, lo siento. So, first of all, I'd just like to, on behalf of myself and Elaine, say thank you to OCA for agreeing to host us for our research sabbatical. We've had a fabulous time so far in Argentina. We've really enjoyed the city and exploring the university here. We'd like to say particular thanks to, I suppose, Carlos and Adriana and all the team who helped us with the paperwork and getting ourselves started with here. Particular thanks to Jorge, who has been, a real gentleman, helped us, answered all our questions, showed us around, and really made us feel welcome here. So thank you very much, Jorge, for that.
You're welcome.
I will briefly introduce myself and move on to my presentation. So my name is, as I said, Patrick Buckley. My PhD is in collective intelligence, which is decision-making systems that combine both humans and information systems together. So, common examples would be things like, for example, Wikipedia, Google search engines, all of these systems that have a very large part of human interaction built into it. I looked at, particularly for my PhD, prediction markets, which led me on to look at gamification, which is how we can use gamification to encourage people to engage with these systems. So I have a range of research interests, and I can't cover them all here today, but if anyone wants to reach out and have a chat with me about any of those things, they're the big topics that I'm looking at. The other topic that I look at quite a bit is the idea of extracurricular activities in higher education. So I want to take you through two studies that I've conducted on that today. I'm going to be doing it quite quickly. I picked this because I felt it was the broadest of my research interests. Most of the people in the room here are professors or teachers. We teach. We're interested in teaching. We're interested in giving students a good educational experience. So I felt this is something that everyone who's involved in academia to a greater degree is touched or is influenced by. Extracurricular activities, I'm going to be running through this fairly quickly. We have 20 minutes, so I will be going through that pace. Again, if anyone has any questions, wants to reach out to me, please feel free to either directly after this presentation or drop me an email. Extracurricular activities are non-academic activities that are conducted under the auspices of a school or a university outside of the normal classroom time. And they have been historically associated with universities since their origins. There are records of societies and sororities dating back to virtually the founding of Oxford and Cambridge and the first universities. So they've always been associated with the university experience and the student experience. What I want to look at today very, very quickly, first of all, is just extracurricular activities in the context of modern higher education. Then I'll talk very quickly about what's the impact of extracurricular activities on the student experience and what's the impact of it on student and alumni loyalty, which would have policy implications for third level institutions. So, we're all, again, I'm assuming most people here are working in a third level, higher education institution, and we're all familiar with the big challenges that we're facing all over the world. Two big ones, two ones that are faced by every university in every country, as near as I can see. Massification. It's the idea that more and more people are going and receiving third level educations. And that's a great thing. We should never lose sight of the fact that that's a great thing. But it presents challenges. Universities were set up, and until very recently, were built around the idea of small classes of small numbers of students. Transitioning to a situation where we're teaching classes of tens or hundreds of students, which is not unusual to be, certainly in Ireland, to have classes of hundreds of students is not unusual. It's not, is the norm at this point. It creates enormous pressures as educators. And it creates all sorts of problems for students and for teachers. How do we reach out to people? But how do students in a class of hundreds feel engaged and motivated and connected to their class? Another major challenge is marketization. Increasingly, the dominant language that is used to describe universities is that of it's a market. Here, students they're not our students, they are our customers, and we are providing them with a service. And that change in perspective from an education to marketization has many impacts. In particular, most governments now across the world think that universities should be more or less self-funding. The provision of third level education is not a common good, it's something that should be provided on a market basis. That leads to all sorts of issues. It leads to, I picked out some of this. It leads to large classes and all the problems associated therein. It leads to employability being the key metric of academic performance these days. There was a time when you went to university to get an education, and if you happened to get a job because you had a good education, that was well and good. But now you go to university to pursue a career. That's for the majority of people. And that is simply the reality of the world we're in. But again, that's not necessarily what universities were set up for. Alumni relations become increasingly important, and I'll talk about that later. In that context, where do extracurricular activities fit in? Well, extracurricular activities, we all know what we're talking about. Playing football, the debating society, acting, etc. There are three main perspectives on how that might impact upon academic performance. First is the zero-sum model. And basically that says students have 40 hours a week. And if they spend 1 hour playing soccer, 1 hour performing in theatre, then that's 1 hour that they're not spending studying, so it's bad for their academic performance. There's only so much time. Another model is the development model. And this basically says, well, no, students receive benefits from playing sport, from meeting with their peers and colleagues. It relieves pressure, it gives them an outlet, it relieves stress. And because of that, they will actually do better. They might spend an hour less studying, but the 39 hours that they do spend studying will be far more productive because they're relaxed, they're focused, and they're engaged. So the idea of the development model is the more time people spend on extracurricular activities, the better they'll do. The threshold model is probably the most commonly used model today, and that basically says, well, it's the U-shape. If people spend a certain amount of time in extracurricular activities and receive benefits like better health, less stress, etc., it improves their performance. But if someone spends all of their time playing on the university soccer team and then the remainder of their time out at a party, that will have a negative effect eventually. So that's one thing. How does extracurricular activities impact upon academic performance? The other issue is that of employability skills. Employability skills are all the kinds of things that we all know employers are looking for but are hard to measure. Things like confidence, things like time management, things like communication, things like being able to work in a team. We know employers want these things. We know they're hard to teach in a classroom. How do you teach someone to be a good team player in a classroom environment? And we also know that students often have problems evidencing them. Everyone can write down their CV, I'm a great team player and I'm a great communicator. How do you provide evidence of that? And often extracurricular activities have a major role in getting people to operate in teams. So you lead the production of a play in your school, you play on your team and you're the captain, and it provides you a way of evidencing skills that are. So the other issue is how does extracurricular activities impact upon these employability skills that we all know? So our first study was designed to take a look at the broad issues around these issues. And we had three main research questions. First of all, which model on the effect of extracurricular activities is the most plausible? Should we believe that extracurricular activities have an impact following the zero-sum model, the development model, or the threshold model? Our second research question, what employability skills are developed by extracurricular activities? And the third question was a broader, what is the effect of extracurricular activities on the student experience, on the lived student experience itself? So yes, we want to look at how it impacts upon academic performance. Yes, we want to look at how it impacts upon their employability skills. But we also wanted to get a sense of how does it impact upon the student's experience of university education. To do that, for our first study, our instrument was an open-ended, anonymous, web-based survey. We asked three open-ended questions. What do you like about ECA participation? What do you dislike? What does it mean to you at a personal level? And students were given the chance to write an open-ended number of sentences answering these questions. So it wasn't a quantitative survey, it was asking qualitative information. The participants were participants in the University of Limerick in extracurricular activities. So that was a population of 5,000. There's roughly, our records show there was 5,078 active participants in extracurricular activities in the University of Limerick. And we received 849 responses, so it's 16.7% response rate, which is reasonable given the type of study that we were involved in. After that, we analysed these textual responses. Essentially, there was a three-stage process whereby the responses were initially coded. The codes were then aggregated together into themes, and then the themes were matched to either the employability skills or else to the student experience. So what we found, and I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly, is we would have found that there was a recognition that by the students involved in extracurricular activities time-consuming, but there was a clear recognition of trade-offs involved. So here would be two specific quotes that we picked out. For example, one student said, "It's very time-consuming. I do spend probably more time on it than I should." And there's a clear recognition of trade-offs. I could be in lots of amazing clubs and I don't have time to be involved in all of it I want. Overall, the data that we would have found, the overall analysis would have supported the threshold model. Certainly, for a majority of students, they derive a benefit from engaging in extracurricular activities. But there is a small but significant cohort of students who will themselves admit, I spend too much time in this stuff and it does impact on my academic performance. So that's something to be aware of when we're thinking about how these activities should be organized and managed. Moving on to employability skills. These are what these percentages represent are the percentage of responses that would have clearly, to our mind, recognized the development of an employability skill as identified by Clark and Al's meta-analysis 2015. And the employability skills that would have clearly been picked up would have things like self-confidence. 15% of our respondents would have talked about how extracurricular activities increase their self-confidence. There is a representative quote. Similar for teamwork, and many extracurricular activities involve working in a team. And the students themselves would recognize, I've learned better how to operate in a team, how to lead a team. And in particular, in contexts where these teams come together by the students, there's no lecturer or academic or parent figure organizing these types of societies. The students do it themselves. So it demonstrates to them themselves, I'm developing how to work as a team. General problem solving would have been identified as being something that was developed by 10% of our students. Communication skills, 6%, self-management by 4%. Now, as I said, these were unprompted responses. We did not ask people, does it improve your teamwork skill? We asked them, what was the effect, do you think? And then based upon our analysis, these are the things we picked up. So we would see that this would show there's a reasonable amount of development of these skills by students. The other topic we wanted to look at, our research question 3, was the impact upon the general student experience. And this, probably for me, this is the one that was most striking out of the 800 odd responses we received, was the number of students who would have used, and to be honest with you, I put this as a heading, participation is founded, because it was the word, if there was one word that kept coming back, that you kept seeing over and over responses, was students refer to the team or the club or the society as being their family, their family in the university. And it's indicative of how much of and family is an emotive word. It's the word we use to describe the people who are closest to us. So it's very important and indicative that these students would describe their teammates, their colleagues as being family. It's indicative of how much of a support network it is. And stress relief with psychological support. Many students talk about how the extracurricular activities provide them with a support mechanism. They provide them with people they can talk to outside of a formal structured route. And of course, that is increasingly something that's of concern both to students but also to universities. We all know we have to help students. The pandemic has taught us how important it is that we can help students and to strengthen their mental health. And this is a tool that does it. I talked about physical health. I go out, I play soccer, it keeps me fit, it keeps me healthy, it keeps me active. I'm not sitting in the library all day, that's good thing. Other things that were very important. Organizational affinity, and I'll be coming back to this, but many students talked about the fact that they developed affinity for their institution, for the university that they were attending, because I played on a team, because I put on a production for that university. I felt a greater affinity to the university, and that we had this idea of managing transitions, how it made it easier for people to come to universities. We all know the problems first years often have when they come to university. They're away from home for the first time, they have no friends, they find it difficult to make friends to settle in. Having a ready community helped like that. It's also very particularly important for international students, people who are coming to a country for a semester. And if they are sports people in a particular type of sports, they can jump into a club and they immediately have a cohort of people around who are, at the very least, interested in the same sport or the same activity that they are. So it helps them to fit into a country and a new place for 6 to 12 months, depending on how long. So, I'll move on to that. So, okay, overall, the findings of this, what I'll say is there's obviously limitations to the study. A big one, it was self-selection. So we asked people who participate in extracurricular activities, and that's what we were interested in asking. We would have found the results being their support for the threshold model. We would have found that it does develop employability skills. We would have found that it provides significant benefits to the participants in terms of the student experience, and it provides a tool. And this is probably from a policy perspective, if we're talking about this from the perspective of a university or academics. Well, it does seem to provide a tool for dealing with some of the challenges that we know are a problem today. Things like students being isolated in the large classes that are caused by massification. Things like students who are experiencing difficulty transitioning from secondary education to tertiary education or moving between countries. Building affinity is another one. I'll very quickly run through the last bit because this goes on to the second study. So when we completed this study, there was an awful lot of opportunities to study to take further studies. One thing which we were interested in was this idea of, in the modern world, higher level education institutions are increasingly looking to build lifelong relationships with their students and their alumni, not just while they're in university, but for that person's life. And there's lots of reasons for it. Many universities want to follow the American route, which is essentially their students graduate and then they give you money, and that money is used to provide funding. So, you know, I think Harvard, I think myself and Elaine had a conversation with the director of the business school in Harvard about 5 years ago, and we discovered that the endowment for Harvard Business School from its alumni was larger than the entire budget of the country of Ireland. So the American model of university is they get money from their alumni and they use that to support their educational activities. And that's something that's useful. But they do lots of other things. They advocate for institutions. Successful alumni will tell the world, I got a good education in this institution. They will contribute to institutional governance. They will sit on courses. They will offer work placements to your students. There's a whole host of things that having a good relationship with your alumni means that you can benefit both them and the institution going forward. So our question was, and traditionally, how that's managed is via sort of direct marketing. So what has been recognized in the literature is receiving an email every 6 months saying, you're an alumni of the University of Limerick, would you like to contribute money, is of limited effectiveness in the modern world. Universities need to start building more proactive, lifelong relationships with them. And what we wanted to find out was whether there's extracurricular participation affects student and alumni loyalty to their institution. Is it a tool which has policy implications? If the answer to this question is yes, then what we have found is we found a reason why higher education institutions should look to support these activities, because it's good for them. It provides them with all the benefits we've just enjoyed. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to not run through. For this, we did a quantitative survey. So we used an analytical survey based on a validated instrument. We did it in 2 universities, one in Ireland and one in France. I won't go through the data because we don't have time. I'll give you briefly the conclusions. Yes, loyalty is significantly impacted by extracurricular activities. We found that organizational loyalty varied across cultural contexts. We found that, in other words, the French university, the students in the French university tend to be more loyal to their institution than the Irish students. But in both cases, we found that extracurricular activity increased loyalty. So the Irish students' loyalty to the University of Limerick in this case increased, but it didn't increase as much, it increased by the same amount as the one in France did, but French students just seem to be more loyal to their third level institution. So there's a cultural element to it, but there is a directionality to the impact, which is important to note. The implication being extracurricular activity is an effective lever to increase student loyalty and alumni loyalty. There's a lot of further research. I'll leave you with this. So we have the first paper has been published in Habits of Learning in Higher Education. That's available as it speaks. The second paper is under consideration in a journal at the minute. If anyone wants to see a preprint of it, if you email me, I can send it along to you, but it's obviously not available publicly yet. In terms of further research and collaboration, this is one of the things that I said might be of interest to people here. There would be lots of scope for perhaps doing a similar study to the earlier one in UCA and comparing and contrasting results. Similarly, the second paper, we have the mechanism whereby we're doing cross-cultural analysis and comparisons already. So again, if there was interest in doing that in UCA, someone could talk to me. I'd be very happy to talk you through. We have the instruments, we have a lot of the literature available. I'll also say, again, in passing, I'm interested in collective intelligence, I'm interested in gamification, I'm interested in AI. If anyone wants to talk to me about any projects they have in that field, very happy to talk to you. I've taken enough of your time. I think I'm at about 20 minutes or a little bit more than that. I'm sorry, but thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Questions or? I do have a question.
We're going to get to the questions at the end.
Yeah.
Entonces hacer todo lo que eran preguntas sobre las presentaciones al final y entonces le damos paso ahora a la presentación de Elaine, ¿sí? Así que al final de su presentación hacemos para todos los presentes y quienes nos están siguiendo en forma remota las consultas, preguntas o comentarios sobre las presentaciones. Así que adelante, muchas gracias.
Hello everyone. Hola a todas. Hablo solo un poquito de español, así que voy a presentar en inglés. So my name is Elaine Doyle, as I've said, and I'm not going to reiterate all of Paddy's thanks just in the interest of time. What I'm going to talk about is a research project that was undertaken a number of years ago, and there are a number of papers that have come out of this. I'm going to talk about the main results quite briefly because there's a lot involved in this, but I can refer you on to the papers or have a chat to anybody who's interested in looking at this a little bit further. But I think this is probably useful. Is just to talk a little bit about the journey here, and to explain my background a little bit, just to show, I suppose, why I'm interested in this area. So I did my degree in the university I'm currently teaching in law and accounting, and then I went on to do a master's in accounting in Dublin. But I was sponsored for that master's by Pricewaterhouse. At the time, it's before they became PricewaterhouseCoopers. I'm very old, but I did my accounting training. So I'm a chartered accountant. I did my training in Pricewaterhouse, and then they merged with Coopers. So I'm a chartered accountant, but I always ever worked in the tax department. And then I also did my chartered tax advisor exams. So I did both accounting and tax, but always worked in tax. So I worked in corporate tax in PwC in Dublin, and then I headed up the corporate tax function of EY in Limerick. So again, the big four sort of loomed large. And then eventually, I suppose I'd always loved studying tax, didn't like practicing it so much. So I joined the UL faculty in 2002, thinking I had loads of qualifications, and then realized I had to do a PhD if I wanted to pursue an academic career. So I did my PhD in tax in the University of Sheffield in the UK from 2005 to 2009. At the time, there was nearly no tax academics with PhDs in Ireland. Now there's a little bit more of an academic scene there. So I'm currently professor of tax, but my research is in ethics. So I just wanted to give that background so that you understand, I suppose, why I'm interested in ethics. And part of it is these kinds of scenes. And Jorge and myself have spoken a little bit about, things like the Starbucks case, and I suppose this whole international recognition that there are lots of large corporates and high net worth individuals who can mess around a bit with the tax system and maybe not pay the fair share that we think they should pay, while lots of other people, don't have that freedom and are suffering from very high tax burdens and just feel that this is not fair. Okay, and most of the time, what those companies and individuals are doing are strictly legal, but we would, there's a feeling like that's not fair, that's unethical. So that's what kind of got me into this stuff in the first place. So just going back. Anyway, what I'm going to go through is very briefly a little bit on literature and theory, because in order to understand what I did, you kind of need to understand a little bit around the theory and then the results and some of the conclusions around that. Okay, so I'm interested in tax practitioners because those large corporates and those high net worth individuals are relying more and more on tax practitioners because tax is complicated. We've got self-assessment systems, we've got a lot of cross-border transactions going on. So individuals often don't know the tax rules. So they rely more and more on tax practitioners to help them out, to be compliant or to try and figure out how they can minimize their tax burden. And the OECD have recognized that tax practitioners contribute to helping taxpayers to comply with legislation, but they also identify them as one of the threats to exchequer returns because of tax avoidance shelters. So a lot of the high net worth individuals or the big corporates can, on the basis of their tax practitioners, navigate their way through different tax systems. And tax practitioners are often accused of being the architects of these quite convoluted structures that allow individuals and corporates to avoid tax. So there is a growing concern around whether this is ethical or not. As accountants, we also have a public interest aspect to our roles, and this is kind of contrary to that whole ethos. And so there is more and more of the literature calling for, or certainly suggesting that tax practitioners have lost concern for the public interest, and they just are thinking about making money, basically. Now that's kind of the ethical dimension to all of this. Okay, so the theory that I draw on here is the theory of cognitive moral development, which some of you may have come across. It's based on a guy called Kohlberg from the 1970s. And cognitive moral development, again, I'm not going to go through this in any level of detail, it's quite involved, but it's kind of the black box in your head that helps you out when you're faced with a dilemma. So it's not actually about the decision or the action that you take. It's about how your mind processes the approach to that decision. So what do you think about justice and cooperation when you're thinking about what you're going to do in a particular situation? Okay. So it's the state of mind of the decision maker, the process that individuals use when they're facing a dilemma. And it's based on a theory, Piaget's theory. So Piaget was a child psychologist, and he looked at development in children, going from very small children to the developmental stage of maybe 11 or 12. So very small children will be guided by, what you're punished for or what you're rewarded for. Some of you that are parents will recognize this. So if you're bad, you're punished, and if you're good, you're rewarded. They don't necessarily think about the behavior behind that. But as they get a little bit older, they realize, well, the rules are not just always the rules. There's negotiation involved here. So Piaget talks about a young child who looks at a situation where one child has broken 15 cups because he was helping his mother do the dishes. And another child broke 1 cup trying to steal something. The very young child will think, the person that broke 15 cups, that was worse. Whereas as you grow older, they'll say, oh no, actually, they were breaking 15 cups helping somebody. So that's a better behavior. So that's the background to Piaget. But Kohlberg then moved that research along by looking at adolescent boys in the US, actually, and came up with this model of cognitive moral development. And again, it's quite an involved theory, but there are 3 different levels. Each level has 2 stages. And the idea is that we progress through these stages as we grow. So we start off being, it's all about punishment and reward. And at this first stage, the pre-conventional level. So you see yourself as external to the rules, you obey the rules because you're going to be punished or rewarded, depending. You eventually, as you grow, get to the stage that you're part of a family and a community. So you want to please that family, you want to please your friends, you want to be accepted as a good person. And so that you'll engage in behavior in a reciprocal way, and that you consider that to be the ethical way to behave. Moving on further to knowing that we don't know everybody. I don't know all of you in this room, but we have to be organized in a certain way. And therefore, if we put in rules and regulations and legislation and we all abide by those, well, then we can all function as a society. So somebody at that level very much wants to obey the rule of law. And if I obey the law, well, that's ethical. That's the mentality at that stage. So these 2 are the conventional level of reasoning. Then you get to the post-conventional, which says, well, not all rules and regulations are fair or they're just. Not all legislation is good for everybody. And then we might have to look beyond that legislation if it's not fair, if it's not based on everybody being equal and so on. So people at this level will look more at the fairness of how is everybody in society treated. And they will consider it ethical if rules and regulations are based on, everybody having a say and so on. So the idea is you develop through these stages, not just because you grow older, but usually because of interaction. At these levels, it's probably just growing up a little bit within your family. But people progress because of social interaction. You go to college, you meet people who don't have the same opinion as you do. You debate and you grow cognitively. And so people will start here, and Kohlberg said they go through, it's like steps of a stairs. Not everybody, at a certain point, people stop, they pop out. So, people mostly are around this level, and then people might develop to a higher level. So that's the theory. Now, in terms of just where this fits, without going into any detail, this is all about moral judgment. It's about the process, the cognitive processes in your mind when you're facing an ethical dilemma. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to behave ethically, because you still have to recognize that there's an ethical issue, then you have to think it through, which is what the piece I'm interested in. Then you have to have the moral motivation to follow that through, and then the actual character that allows you to do the right thing. So we're only looking at this piece. We're not necessarily saying it's going to result in an ethical behavior, but you can't have ethical behavior without this piece. So that's where it fits, which is where So the next evolution of this theory was James Rest, who was a student of Kohlberg's. When Kohlberg looked and developed this theory, he based it on interviews with people, which is very laborious and hard to measure. What James Rest did was he developed a psychometric instrument that actually measured where people were. Now, he didn't believe that people step up the stairs in the way Kohlberg did. He felt like it was a slight movement from going, from the very kind of selfish almost to a little bit more law and order to a little bit, see, it was sort of a distribution of thinking. So what the defining issues test, which he came up with, is a psychometric instrument. It's a multiple choice. And what it measures is, it gives you a measure of a P-score, which is the percentage of your thinking done at that high level of ethical reasoning, the post-conventional level. So you get the P-score. So the test involves a number of scenarios, so little stories. So you read the story, and then it lists off a number of considerations, 14 considerations after it. And it asks you to read the story and then to tick off the ones that you think are important, the top 4, if you were approaching that decision. And the measurement is based then on all of those 14 are linked to different levels on Kohlberg's scale, and it measures then, it gives you a score at the end of the day. So that's sort of how it works in practice. Now, sorry, I'm not going through all of these slides in detail, but the issue with this is whether this works in a business setting. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to look at tax practitioners potentially using this instrument. But this instrument is a social instrument. So one of the scenarios is about Heinz and the drug. And Heinz is a guy whose wife is dying of an illness. They have diagnosed a particular drug for her, but he can't afford to buy the drug. So he goes to the pharmacy and he begs the pharmacy to say, look, my wife really needs this drug. I can't afford to buy it. Can you give it to me and I'll try and pay you back? And the pharmacist says, no way, I'm in business too. I have to survive. I'm not giving you the drug. And the end of the story just says, should Heinz break into the pharmacy? Okay. We're not really interested in whether he did or not, but then it's all of these different considerations, like it's not good to break the law, but your wife's life is more important than the law. So it goes through the considerations and then you take them off. The issue is people have used this instrument in a business setting, but the criticism in the literature says, well, how can you do that? Because if you give me, say, Paddy, that scenario, he's not thinking as a tax practitioner, he's thinking as a husband. So can you really measure people's reasoning in a professional context using a social scenario test? That's what I kind of found from the literature. So basically, now the test has been used in accounting, but they've used that social test. And surprise, surprise, and the test did find that an awful lot of people working in accounting had a lower level of ethical reasoning than you would expect for the level of their education. Okay, accounting students also. And the literature suggested that that was because of the rule-based nature of accounting, that we take people into college in accounting and we teach them all the IFRSs and all of the rules and how do you do your consolidated accounts. And we don't necessarily teach around these bigger issues. We don't really debate. We don't maybe talk about ethical dilemmas. I think we probably do a little bit more now, but we didn't maybe do in the past. Lawyers got higher scores in the tests that they've done in literature, but nobody had ever used a control group. And this was another flaw that I found, is that, again, if I test all of you guys, well, maybe it's just because we're living here in Argentina at the moment and whatever. If you don't use a control group, how can you measure necessarily a particular group of questions? Okay, so what I then, these were kind of, I'm jumping around a little bit, but these were my research questions. Does the tax profession attract people for whom a particular level of moral reasoning predominates? So are we attracting a particular type of individual into tax? That was the first question. Or does the tax context do something to people, you know, in terms of how their reasoning works? And then following on from that, how, you know, does the training or socialization of tax practitioners have an impact, you know, on their responses? So these were the, now, as in all research projects, these emerge often after you've seen your results. So I suppose that's the way it kind of goes. So how do we address the questions? Well, I developed, it took about a year and a half, a tax-specific version of the DIT. I worked with scholars that were expert in the DIT in order to come up with scenarios that were tax-based and lists of considerations that were tax-based, but that still kept the psychometric integrity of the test. And working with DIT scholars who knew that test really well was necessary to make sure that we were still testing for the same stuff. And then we also used a control group. So we wanted tax practitioners, but then we wanted normal people that were not involved in tax to make sure that we could actually contrast the results. So this was the research design. We had tax practitioners, we had non-tax specialists, then we had a tax version of the DIT, and then the DIT with the social scenario. So we kept that. So we were able to have a sort of a research design that was sort of experimental. So it was distributed to 690 individuals in Ireland, 384 tax practitioners. I was lucky because I'd worked in tax. This is part of the reason that it works.
Those non-specialists are the same level of education like college.
Not necessarily, but we controlled that. So we asked everybody about their level of education. It was literally anybody at all that wasn't working in tax, but we controlled for age, education, degree, non-degree. I'll talk about it. So we got a response rate of 42%. Again, I wouldn't have got that if I hadn't been working in tax in the past. At least the firms did help to distribute the instrument. So about a 42% response rate. We ended up, the test itself is quite complicated, and it also accounts for people just taking a box and not taking it seriously. So there's an integrity test within that psychometric instrument. So if people didn't fill it out correctly, then we didn't use the responses. So we ended up with 201 usable responses after elimination. So there was about half and half tax practitioners and non-tax practitioners. So we looked at degree education. We also looked at the order in which they got the instrument. So if people filled out the social scenarios first, did that influence the tax responses and vice versa? So we had we changed the order of the things and tested for the order. We tested for degree education, and those two in a regression analysis did have an impact on the responses. The ones that didn't that we tested were age, gender, postgrad education, and then just for the tax practitioners, their years of experience in tax and their position in the firm, so their seniority levels. And none of those variables had an impact on the results. The degree level and the order did, so we controlled for those then in our model. So this was the model. We won't go into the details of how we did it. But these are just broadly the results. So DIT is social context, the tax one obviously is the tax context. So if we look at the blue line is the non-specialist, the green line is the tax practitioner. So when they've completed the social context test, they were all around the same. When the context changed to tax, the tax practitioners lowered their level of ethical reasoning, but the non-specialists didn't. They maintained their level. Okay, so that was kind of interesting because first of all, that actually did tell us that we don't have dodgy people going into tax necessarily. They're all the same in the social context, but there's something about the tax context that changes, but it doesn't change for non-specialists. So it's not tax itself, it's something that happens either in the socialization or the training. Now, what was great was we also then had on our data whether people were Big Four or non-Big Four, and we also had tax practitioners from the Revenue Authority. And when we separated, the Big Four versus non-Big Four made no difference. So we separated out the revenue, and when we did, it was marked a difference because the revenue practitioners acted in the same way as the members of the public at large, and taking them out made an even bigger impact on the change with the tax practitioners. So it's not tax knowledge It can't be tax knowledge because the revenue people know a lot about tax. It has to be something in the private practice that changes how the tax practitioners reason, probably something around the socialization or having private clients. So that was the main results of the study. So really, I've kind of explained that. It has to be some sort of training socialization. It's not about dodgy people going into the profession necessarily, but we reckoned at the end of that paper, this particular paper, that it must be something to do with the law and order reasoning, because that seemed to be where they were hitting. So, you can have this ethical dimension when you're talking about social stuff, but the minute as a private sector tax practitioner, I have to talk about tax, I go to the law and order. Because I can't afford to have ethics with my client. I'm responsible for making sure that they know exactly what the law is and complying with the law. That's what our conclusion was, but it needed a little bit more further analysis. But overall, also, the P-scores, the actual measure from all across our sample were a lot lower than they would have been in reported literature, because this instrument is kind of owned by a particular center, and they take in the scores and they have a database which gives averages and so on, so you can kind of compare. But the last time they did that was 1986. So we reckon, it's really not good to use those average scores anymore because they're completely out of date. Okay, so there's other aspects of the work. In order to develop the instrument, the tax instrument, I did interviews with tax practitioners in order that those scenarios were realistic and represented what the ethical dilemmas they came across. So that actually became another paper because there was a lot of interesting findings from that in terms of tax practitioners not really understanding what I meant by ethics in tax, but speaking in a language of risk management. So that was kind of an interesting paper. We also did an analysis of Big Four versus non-Big Four, so there's a paper on that. And we looked beyond the P-score into what's happening beneath the figures in the instrument, which just published recently. And then the other part that I became interested in, a little bit like Patty from this work, was how do we now educate to ensure that our students, the next generation of tax practitioners, get a chance to really develop their moral thinking. So I've done not a lot, but a few papers on how we should be teaching maybe to try and move the dial a little bit more towards ethical sensitivity. Okay, yes, that's the advantages of the control group have been amazing because we couldn't have told those differences. We couldn't unpack the results unless we had that control group. So that was kind of shows the impact of the control group. So these are some of the papers in that area in ethics, some of them in the education side, and then some of them just going into more nuances on those scores. So sorry, now I've taken so long. That was a very quick run through, I suppose, of what is quite a complicated theory and instrument. So the papers that I have give those in more detail, but I'd be delighted to speak to anybody about any of this stuff. I think myself and Jorge have been talking a little bit about dilemmas that people might face in Argentina as a tax practitioner that might be different from Ireland. So it could be interesting to look at this in a different context where things are quite complicated, because I suppose in Ireland, we probably have that law and order reasoning. My sense is from speaking to people, one of the scenarios that I had in my tax instrument talked about a business that has 2,000 employees, and they need a particular tax relief in order to sustain the business. But they've missed the deadline, and they don't have some of the documentation, so they kind of make it up. And under Kohlberg's model, if the rationale for that is that you're saving 2,000 jobs, that would probably trump being compliant with the legislation. So it'd be very interesting to see in a different context, in a different country with different economics, whether the tax practitioners would be different or not. So I think that would be really interesting. Otherwise, both of us work on innovation in higher ed. Patty's doing a lot of close and that stuff. We've done some gamification work, and I've also done a lot of stuff on co-creation with students. And then I'm looking at the moment at tax policy stuff as well. And what else? Oh, the AI, yeah, the impact of artificial intelligence on the tax profession. And I have a PhD student that's just finished now, and he's looking at voice and silence within the tax profession and how employees in the Big Four, how comfortable they are in speaking up about issues, which has been really interesting. So we're working on a paper on that.
Maybe a question.
Sure.
Do we think that debate that the progressive or the regressive? Can you understand?
No, just explain that again.
I repeat, which you think that the base that the progressive or the regressive
The progressive or
class?
the tax in Ireland.
Okay.
It's quite progressive, very progressive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why?
It's progressive because at a certain level of salary, you pay no tax. At a certain level, then you pay 20% tax, and it's only when you get beyond a certain threshold that you pay 42% tax. But then we have a range of different taxes, like a suite of different taxes. We have a value-added tax, we have a capital gains tax, we have inheritance and gifts taxes. So the one that's regressive is probably the VAT, the value-added tax. That's quite a regressive tax, because most people who don't have much money spend all of their money on things like food and so on. So poorer people pay proportionately higher in VAT than people that can save. But all of our other taxes are progressive.
Thank you.
Any other?
You took with the same study here in Argentina.
Yes.
Perhaps you estimate that the results will be different.
I think they might be. Yes, I think they might be. I suspect. I was talking. When we were walking in this morning. I was thinking about this. I think potentially in Argentina, the tax practitioners might be more likely to go with the more ethical answer, or think about, for example, 2,000 people might lose their jobs, because of something. In Ireland, I think they're more probably about the law, the legislation. My understanding is that it's difficult to be completely compliant with tax law in Argentina to survive as a business. So I think they could be quite different. Yeah, I think that would be really interesting to look at, actually. Now, different, but I think, working with the tax system in a way that makes businesses still sustainable is probably where the tax practitioner's head is at here. Whereas I think in some place like Ireland, where there isn't as many problems in the economy, it's a little bit more like making sure people are just compliant. So I think the law and order piece would drive the practice more. I think here, it might be different. But it'd be interesting to do it though. Somebody wants to translate.
That's the dilemma, is to how finance a company. Because if you don't pay the tax and take a plan to pay installments, you will get tax rates, tax authorities of 20%. If you ask to loan to the public, as pay 80 to 90%, this context is high inflation.
Yes, yeah.
So sometimes in this context of crisis, the ethic dilemma is to not pay taxes and finance with this.
Yeah, no, that's why I think the answers would be different, because I think people have to think in a different way that we don't have to think about in some countries because we don't have those issues. So yeah, I think that would be interesting. Yes.
Sorry,
Yeah, do we want to?
like
No. Sorry.
Just another question. Yeah, sure. You're very interesting. I was thinking about the order of ethical decision making. That at the lowest level is punishment and obedience related to very young children and how they see things. But at the same time, I think that if you look at how people with speeding, people speed or not, it has a lot to do with whether or not they're going to be stopped by a cop. And there's evidence people buy, speed trap detectors and so forth. So I guess I'm having a hard time understanding these levels, and it's almost like it's at the better level to have that more complex decision making concerning the effect on jobs or the larger social justice implications of the decisions, and how that would be, how it would come out in Argentina. In some ways, initially when you began, I thought you know, I think probably I've lived in Argentina for over 25 years. I think that some of my attitudes towards paying taxes might have changed over that time from living in Argentina. Because there's such just, you know, excessive taxation, I think in many ways. A lot of us would agree, corruption, you feel like your government doesn't provide the goods and, you know, the services that it should provide and so forth. And so that would make you tend to be a little bit more lax in terms of but from what I'm getting the impression from what you're saying is that would be a movement down sort of that scale. Or not, and or that then what you mentioned later on, I thought, well, maybe it's actually not as bad as I thought, because I often think to myself, boy, I've really become.
But what this measures,
You know what I'm saying? But
what this measures, remember, is it's not actually the behavior, it's the reasoning behind behavior. So, for example, you decide to comply with taxes. Okay, so you could your behavior is I'm being compliant. Now that could be because you don't want to be fined, because you know you're going to be audited and you could be fined and you're going to be thrown in jail. Okay, so I'm going to be compliant with my taxes because I have to, or else I'll get thrown in jail. That's a very low level of moral reasoning. At the middle level, you might say, well, I'm going to comply with taxes because we all have to, and that contributes towards, you know, it says it in the law, and I'm going to comply with the law. Okay, so you comply for a completely different reason. You're still complying, the behavior is the same, but the rationale is different. The next person higher up the chain in terms of ethical reasoning might say, well, I'm going to comply, not because it's the law, but because it's the right thing to do, because taxes fund schools, taxes fund hospitals, and we can't function as a society without taxes, for example, to pay for, you know, people in hospital who can't, or, you know, people who are disabled and can't work for themselves. So all three people have behaved in the same way, but their rationale for doing so is completely different. So the same can be flipped around. So you don't comply with your taxes. Okay, so I don't comply because I just want the money for myself. You know, I don't care about anybody else. I want the money for myself, so I'm not going to comply. Okay, you're not complying for a very selfish reason. If you're not complying because you're trying to run business and you employ 2,000 people, and you know if you pay the taxes, your business is going to go belly up, then your rationale is very different. So it's not actually about the behavior, it's about your cognitive thinking when you're approaching behavior, which is why it's difficult a little bit to measure. You know, all of us could pay our taxes or not pay, but all for different reasons. So it's trying to get behind, you know, now I do think, just again from comments I've heard around, and I don't live here permanently, so I only know a little bit from what I've heard. But I think, you know, if there's a tax system that is almost impossible to comply with, well, then there's something wrong with the system. And you know, so I think my observation on that would be the system has to change at that point.
Yes, on that point, I would say maybe the state legitimacy is a factor.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. So I don't know if any of you've seen Eric Kirkler's model of tax compliance. So he has a model of tax compliance called the slippery slope, and the two dimensions are trust in the government and the power of the government. So if the government is powerful, people will pay their taxes because they're afraid not to, because they might be fined or audited. But if the people trust the government, they're much more likely to comply voluntarily, which is cheaper because you don't have to have all the audits and the fines and so on. So ideally, what you want, a powerful government, but one that people trust, that maximizes compliance. If you only have one or the other, it doesn't necessarily work.
Since today we have a generalized mistrust in states in general, even in democracies, so the consequence was be that only the regimes they can or I know because in the transparency context of internet and communications, trust in general in governments is very low in the democracy. So
it's a huge problem, hugely problematic. Yeah, I think there has to be trust almost on both sides as well. The taxpayers need to trust the government and the government needs to trust the taxpayers. And that, but you also have to have a little bit of power so that those that will never comply, because it's very hard for you, okay, you can trust the government, but if you know that your neighbor isn't paying their tax, you're going to lose trust. So they both also are not, they're not separate things. They also, power, sometimes if it's used well, can enhance trust, and trust used well can enhance power. So
first, I think I got the name you mentioned recently for this model of tax compliance with
it's called the slippery slope. Eric Kirchler.
Oh.
Eric Kirchler. K-I-R-C-H. Eric Kirchler. I can send you the link. He's in Austria, in Vienna.
And the other thing about compliance, I think it's takes a while. I mean, like you see in many like Asian countries like Japan or Taiwan, you see a very high level of compliance with many concept tax, also sort of regulation that, I mean, there is a lot of learning. There are several generations with certain types of behavior and education, which means that, you know, I've seen that, you said that about American in Argentina. I don't know anything about taxes because I don't work on taxes, but like the way they drive is different here than what they do in the US. And the reason is typically we don't have such heavy fines, or you don't have a problem with your insurance policy, you have some minor misdemeanor with traffic. So I think it takes a while. It's not just the person, but also the context, and probably there is learning. That's my personal experience. Just say that. And the other thing I had a question about when you talk about extracurricular activities, you mentioned that there may be some difference between one and the other. You mentioned better communication skills, but also teamwork and physical activity. And it came to my mind that you may be talking about very different types, like play rugby versus manage teams.
It's one of the things we're hoping to unpick in one of our next studies is to start. So I have a categorization. So you would have so an obvious one would be team sports versus individual activities. To be honest with you, yeah, it's the next stage is where we're going to start unpicking that. You would be very surprised if, for example, things like teamwork aren't impacted by it being a team sport versus an individual activity. It's something we need to look into. Absolutely, yeah.
I also have a question for you. So I was very interested on that aspect of the types of values promoted by the activities. And so, and mainly the opposition between business schools and education between the employees ideology or orientation versus entrepreneur. So traditional business schools have been mainly about the preparing employees for companies managers. But today the entrepreneurial both demand students and evolution of society comes in more and more. Shared schools, etc. So is there a possible link to explore in the future on type of values?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's an interesting idea. I mean, I think, I suppose, would entrepreneurship be an orientation that would possibly revolve around things like self-confidence, things like I see it's a very interesting question now, to be honest with you, and I haven't gone into it in any detail in my head. My first gut reaction would be I don't know about entrepreneurship. It's not my area at all, but my sense is that there are a set of attributes of people who tend to be entrepreneurs, things like confidence, things like independence, things like leadership. And I suppose what you would probably try to do is look at first of all, look at the entrepreneurship literature to figure out what those attributes are. And I haven't done that, so I don't know. I'm only speculating after that. And then you'd be looking at, okay, well, can we start to cross-reference those attributes with attributes that we see being developed by extracurricular activities? And my gut would be, I have a suspicion it would be a very hard thing to unpick, because my gut is the same kind of people who will start a business, or the same kind of people who will go out and organize the 5-a-side kick around, or will, I sense,
Thank you.
bye, catch up. My sense would be the same kind of people who will be involved in extracurricular activities and out and active and engaged and get up and go, are the same kind of people who will be entrepreneurs anyway. So it might be difficult to
Figure out the cost.
you'd be finding it seems like they're the same people, which would make it difficult to do a thing. But that is literally me. I'm thinking off the top of my head now, so I won't speculate anymore. But it's something that's very interesting, and we should look into in more detail. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thanks for the idea.
Thank you. I have another question. So being from the marketing discipline, I was interested about like marketing loyalty research, and I was thinking in terms of, well, a marketing term, which is customer satisfaction. Things in today's business school education, students are customer sense. And so how does these activities impact satisfaction through the emotional bonding and use, and so may impact the choice of a given university over another, as well as of investigation, how they may of activity of.
Oh yeah, I mean certainly some universities will push it. I mean, UL, our university, we're lucky. We're the only, so the other Irish universities are all going up inside of cities. UL is only 50 years old, so they built a greenfield. Something was built outside of the city. Yes, of course you have. So we've massive sporting facilities. So UL's marketing, if you look at UL marketing courses, we're the UL sporting campus. We have clubs, we have football pitches, we have the river, so we have bowling. So it's certainly, I think quite a lot of universities will come to our university because we're offering these extracurricular activities. So it is something that universities, you see it already.
But we went to the big drama society. Other universities in Dublin are probably more.
Yeah, you see, they have the history and things like, there'll be certain things that like I suppose Trinity is the oldest university, and there's a certain association with Trinity and literature, which probably leads on to like the dramatic arts.
Yes.
That's what we push. We've got pitches everywhere. We've got the River Shannon. We've got all the sporting facilities. So you can see the universities will orientate their marketing on the basis of that as well.
Versus branding through the extracurricular activities.
Yeah, but it's definitely pushed in UL. Definitely, it's a big thing. Yeah.
And also,
Oh yeah.
when you see some movies or films, you can see the American universities with sports, or things that perhaps you see, no, these people all day are getting in sports.
Yes.
But it's like contracts with this kind of university, this part of the world.
Yes.
But perhaps there's some problem culture, because parents and professors say to the student, no, focus in the subject, no sports, because you lose your time. But perhaps this problem, for instance, here at this university, we receive people from all the provinces in Argentina and abroad. And these students sometimes adapt to the university life.
Yeah.
Because are isolated, because have problems to communication. And perhaps these extracurricular activities will change this problem. And the first year of the grade student, sometimes 20-25% of the students leave university for problems of adaptation.
Yeah.
And perhaps it will be a solution that is required a change of culture.
Yeah.
I also think since pandemic, I don't know how you find it here. And so our university is mostly physical, very little online. Then the pandemic happened, we had to transition obviously into online. so hard now to get students back into class because they're all like, oh no, I'm happy in my bedroom. They might be happy there, but it's not good for them.
It's not, no.
So we're trying to say, we're not being mean about saying we're not putting things online. It's much better for your physical and mental health to be in a room with other people. But it's very hard now to get that message across because of the pandemic. So, but I think some of this research being published is a good case for showing, no, we're not just being
Not just
teachers. We do think it's better for you to
be physically walking around the campus, even if you can't see it. Like it's a bit like anything. It's a bit like running. You know, you start running or something, like you start exercising and it's pain, and eventually, you know, a lot of people will get into exercise when they get older and they start running, and it's very hard to start, and then eventually 5 years later they're going to go, geez, I can't imagine living my life not going out for a run in the morning, wake up. You have to be forced to do something that's good for you, and that runs against the ethos. But like there's an element of that with things like physical attendance on campus and extracurriculars. There's a reluctance from people to maybe take the first step from students, and there's often a reluctance on behalf of universities and academics to push people to take that first step, or say, oh no, we should let people make their own decisions. But sometimes you should kind of say, no, do go and get involved in something or other, and you'll thank us later. Like so.
Does your university continue to have many online classes, or
not really, but you do have some. We have a huge housing crisis. I think everywhere in the world has a housing crisis at the moment, but we have a big housing crisis. So you have students saying, I can't get accommodation in the city, so I now have to get on a bus for 2 hours. So I'm only going to come in 1 day a week. Please provide me with all of the, I want to be able to Zoom in, or can you provide me with recordings of the lectures? And it's very difficult. You do understand some of them have genuine not able to be there, but at the same time, we were never an online university. So, and we were never responsible for accommodation, but it does seem like that problem has been kind of shoved back a little bit onto the lecturers to say, you need to help me because I can't physically be there. So,
but notionally, we're fully
fully in the
fully up. Yeah. No, there's just stuff around the edges. Yeah.
For lots of reasons, but the housing crisis is not helping. And I think also with the pandemic, a lot of student housing where people might have taken in students into empty rooms, that stopped. And then a lot of rentals sort of went to maybe families, and they haven't converted them back to student accommodation. So there's a lot of things happening with housing. And then with the war in the Ukraine, Ireland took in 60,000 Ukrainians, and we're trying to house them. So it's not an easy.
Anyway.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Elaine Doyle.